Egypt, a country probably best known for its ancient landmarks and river system. Egypt has existed as a society in one form or another for thousands of years, stretching back all the way to the dawn of civilization. It was once one of, if not the most sophisticated regions in the ancient world, but today, unfortunately, it's a bit of a different story. The country is still home to a major economy, but since it's also home to the 13th largest population in the world, that productivity is spread extremely thin, which makes it one of the poorest nations on the Mediterranean. But in the words of every shady real estate agent ever, it has potential. Massive potential. It's easy to overlook, but Egypt has all the right ingredients to be a global top 10 superpower. Now, obviously, between that optimistic hypothetical and the current reality, there are a lot of challenges, both from within and abroad. While the country has recently been experiencing some truly encouraging levels of industrial growth, there are unfortunately some recent developments that make it look like it's not necessarily going in the right direction. It's dealing with heavy tensions between its neighbours, who are threatening to cut it off from its ancient lifeline, and equally severe tensions from within that have gone so far as to motivate the government to move its entire capital city to somewhere they're a little bit further removed from the angry mobs. No matter how much potential an economy has, it's never going to be able to capitalise on it under these circumstances. But there's also a little bit more to this story than yet another hopeful economy undone by corruption and instability. No matter which direction Egypt goes, it has the potential to drag entire economic regions along with it, and to find out why, we must as always answer a few simple questions. So, why should Egypt be one of the most powerful economies in the world? Why isn't it? And finally, how could its success or failure impact an entire global hemisphere? Once we have done all of that, we can put Egypt on the Economics Explained leaderboard. If you've ever tried creating a high-quality YouTube video, you know it takes a lot of effort, from scripting and editing to finding the right footage. That's where our sponsor, InVideo AI, comes in. Think of it as a co-pilot for video creation. Let's say you want to make a video for your business to show off your products or your team, but you don't have hours to spend learning video editing or putting the materials together. InVideo AI can handle the heavy lifting if you give it a simple prompt. Here's a great example. I can say, make a short form video about how AI can change the media industry, make it relatable and use a young male voice with a fast pace but a few funny anecdotes in the explanations. The video should be no longer than 60 seconds. Just type it in and InVideo creates a complete first draft for you within minutes.
AI is like that super smart friend who knows everything. In media,
Now, I don't use AI for script writing or research, so if you prefer to write the script yourself, you can paste it into InVideo, and it can handle everything else, adding subtitles, creating voiceovers, or finding the perfect stock footage. You can then fine-tune every detail with simple text commands, for example, to change the intro, adapt the subtitles, or switch out video clips. There's even an option to clone your own voice into other languages. InVideo AI saves you hundreds of dollars each month by combining the functionality of over 10 tools into one. You can try InVideo AI for free, but if you're serious about video creation, consider the paid plan, which starts at just $20 per month. Check the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen and use my code to get double the video generation credits in your first month. From the reign of the pharaohs, to the Nubians, to the Assyrians, to the British involvement in recent centuries, there's plenty to talk about in regards to Egypt's history, both cultural and economic. But even the modern nation as it exists today claimed its independence over a century ago now, and even in that time it's changed a lot. Of course, no matter what time period we're looking at, we can't address the economic functioning of Egypt without addressing its Nile River, a 6,650-kilometre long water supply between Lake Victoria and the Mediterranean Sea. One of the most important elements of the country's current economy is its enormous potential workforce. Egypt's population has become massive, with many of them just now entering the workforce, and 94% of its 104 million people live along the massive Nile River that runs through it, mostly at the basin. This is really the only reason people can inhabit the country in these numbers, as most of Egypt is as barren as the Persian Gulf countries addressed in a recent video. Also, beyond just offering life support to a huge and growing population, inland waterways are about the cheapest and most efficient form of transportation for trade and commerce, and unlike the open ocean, almost anything that floats is seaworthy enough to move materials and labour along their shores. Major empires, both ancient and modern, have benefited from the Nile even before the recent changes we'll address later, and Egypt doesn't even need to invest anything into making this vital piece of transport infrastructure. Since industrialisation, freight rail can be competitive on a cost per kilometre basis with inland waterways, but the size of the goods being transported is more limited. Rail lines and supporting infrastructure also need to be created, representing a massive upfront investment that isn't necessary for floating stuff on barges. It's a massive expense that Egypt really doesn't have to deal with, and when combined with its new market-orientated economy, this makes the country attractive for investors seeking low labour costs, low transport costs, and fewer chances of transport issues, theoretically. The consistent benefits garnered from this river is one of the major reasons that Egypt has become a surprisingly competitive manufacturing power, but it's not the only reason. While the Nile is vitally important for the country's industry and everyday amenities, another waterway, the Suez Canal, is equally important for global industries. Most estimates put the global percentage of trade passing through the Suez Canal at about 12 to 13%, handling anywhere from 25 to 35% of global container traffic every single year. The role of Egypt and its canal in global trade is so significant that any blockage or interference results in the loss of billions of dollars. In times of conflict, businesses can theoretically be crippled in a matter of weeks if the Suez is inactive, and this, arguably more than the legendary Nile, is primarily what has made Egypt a global economic linchpin in the 21st century. In fact, a real-life scenario where this globalising artery was clogged happened just a few years ago, although, to be honest, it does feel like it was just a couple of months ago. But anyway, in 2021, the Ever Given, a massive ship capable of carrying 20,124 shipping containers, struggled to stay straight while travelling through the canal in the middle of a sandstorm. It rammed the side of the canal en route to its destination, and when a few Egyptian tugboats failed to pull the vessel out of the sand and the mud, excavators were brought onto the scene to start clearing a better path. The ordeal was such an international worry that virtually every news outlet was covering the excavation process, with everything from Dutch and Japanese salvage companies to the President of the United States offering their support to resolve the issue as soon as possible. Now, it's true that the Suez Canal has had two separate lanes to avoid this kind of problem, while also allowing for smoother travel, as the canal has ships coming from both directions, but the Ever Given was stuck in a location that blocked off the flow of traffic for everyone. It wasn't just a hiccup anymore, it was a disaster. About 370 ships had to drop anchor or float idly, holding up the transfer of goods worth approximately $9.6 billion every day. With logistics struggles during the COVID pandemic, this wasn't something that most countries could afford, as the rate of trade was already slowed and disordered during the lockdowns. And while some chose to make the journey around the Cape, others stuck around making the bet that the canal would be cleared in time to still remain punctual. Ultimately, it took 150 hours to finally fix the mounting catastrophe, and this was only possible because 14 tugboats took advantage of the high spring tides to finally dislodge it. For every ship that goes through the Suez Canal, Egypt earns an average of $300,000 in fees, so even outside of any geopolitical advantages, it's a genuinely great source of foreign revenue for the nation, but they really suffer if it doesn't work properly, and the cost for countries that use it is so great, there's always a looming international interest to keep it operational. In good times, Egypt can use the Suez Canal to leverage its still relatively low-cost labour force to produce items incredibly competitively, because it can get cheap components from Asia, use its cheap labour force and developing manufacturing process to assemble them, and then its cheap shipping setup to get them directly into Europe. If it was working at its maximum potential, it would be hard to compete with that. Now, reaching that potential is another story. Egypt actually has a rather diverse economy compared to its African neighbours, making it only second to South Africa in terms of GDP diversity. Recent findings stemming from the aforementioned changes in 2000 showed a promising distribution in their industries, and they have an enviable labour position as well, with 60% of their population under the age of 30 who can take the reins and expand their economy even further. A far cry from the current base of manufacturing powers, who are all almost universally dealing with ageing populations. Since the 1970s, Egypt has massively increased its manufacturing sector, and that growth has remained consistent even in the wake of its domestic struggles, recovering its losses from the revolution of 2011 and the protests of 2016 within the decade. But again, more on that later. Beyond manufacturing, the country is ranked as the 5th largest African crude oil producer and the 3rd in natural gas, with the highest refinery capacity on the continent. The export of fossil fuels accounts for about 15% of their GDP, enough to be a significant boost to foreign revenues, but not enough to become totally resource dependent. With all of this, its strategic position, growing low-cost labour force, easy and cheap transportation infrastructure provided by nature, and frankly more energy than it can even use, there are reasons to be optimistic that this current wave of growth will continue to increase incomes for everyday citizens in tangible ways. Its roads that have fallen into disrepair are now being handled with an $895 million government plan to reduce road congestion, building more than 40 new bridges, and the Suez Canal is on its way to being expanded. But even with this promise, there are some very serious challenges that are going to need to be addressed if the country is going to become a middle-income economy. As per usual, what is good for the country is not always necessarily what is good for its rulers. The country has a long-standing enthusiasm for constructing monuments in the sand, projects that cripple their economy, brought on and encouraged by those in power to immortalise themselves. And this is by no means a practice relegated to history. Even today, the country is building a new capital city 20 miles east of Cairo at massive public expense to be further away from the potential angry mobs that might want to topple the government. This ground-up construction is projected to cost the country about $58 billion, with a massive central park, a cutting-edge business district, the world's largest obelisk, and a giant plot for the Octagon, meant to house the Egyptian Ministry of Defense, which normally should be at least 60% better than the Pentagon of the US military. A lot of analysts fairly point out that this is just an administrative hideout, as very few Egyptians can afford to live here, let alone uproot their lives to resettle. And that's pretty much the not-so-secret plan, with the government having learned how vulnerable it is sharing its capital with the people it has to answer to. There's also the elephant in the room of Egypt's economy. It's debt. Lots and lots of debt. In 2023, Egyptian debt to GDP was 95%, which to be fair is lower than a lot of major economies in the world, including the USA. But it's still a lot for a relatively poor country not borrowing in its own currency and paying a much higher interest rate on that borrowing. To make matters worse, this year Egypt's central bank increased interest rates by 600 basis points. Their infrastructure spending is slowing down as it gets harder to borrow, and the Egyptian pound has been ranked amongst the worst performing currencies in the entire world. There don't appear to be signs of future improvement, at least in the short term. This turbulence has only contributed to high tensions, causing further instability and uncertainty around the country's governance, which in turn makes it harder for them to borrow more money or attract foreign business partnerships. The potential of Egypt is massive, and something like a European car manufacturer could set up highly competitive plants there, but the investment into training and infrastructure would be significant, and it could all be at risk with another government shake-up. This new capital is supposed to curb that threat. It's close enough to Cairo to still be able to oversee the bigger city, but far enough away that elite government workers and the ruling class have a safety buffer from potential angry rioters in a luxurious cocoon. And then there is the issue of the Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Here's why that's a problem. Ethiopia's highlands supply more than 85% of the water that flows through the Nile River, a major vein that keeps Egypt not only industrially functional, but alive. Ethiopia argues that the construction of the dam won't dramatically impact the flow of water into the basin, but Egypt is sceptical. Their historical efforts stemming from the colonial period to keep construction projects like this out of the waterway make this a serious issue in the eyes of the Egyptian government. Adding to the foreign relations nightmare, Ethiopia has been searching for an infrastructural goal that would help its economy, and the dam has received public support, a tandem effort with China, which has put a plan in motion faster than most expected. In fairness, this could reduce water flow that is already dwindling in recent decades and put huge pressures on the population that depends on this lifeline for food, water, irrigation, industry, and transportation. Currently, although many upstream countries don't see the issue, it's causing escalating tensions, with Egypt even threatening to blow up the dam if it gets bad enough. This has obviously caused international pushback, with countries like the United States suggesting that they might withhold aid to Ethiopia, and China sitting on the opposite side of the aisle given the fact that they're deeply entrenched in the Belt and Road project. In reference to the expansion of the Suez Canal, the media strategy for the country has been to make it look like an upgrade, but that's far from the case. What's actually happening is that the Suez Canal is also being squeezed by conflicts in Yemen targeting ships making the passage. This is restricting that major revenue centre for Egypt. All of this combined with the luxurious new capital city paints a pretty bleak picture. Oh, and look, they're planning on making a bid for the 2036 and 2040 Olympics. Jokes aside, nobody can predict the future, least of all economists. But Egypt is full of opportunities that will be squandered without a serious system reboot. And this is a problem for everyone. The Suez Canal is a major global lifeline that, as we saw earlier with the Ever Given getting stuck for a week or the Yemen attacks, has the potential to massively influence the global economy. If the country is pushed to military action to deal with domestic or foreign threats, the canal could become even more compromised, further hampering global traffic, which is already tossing up going the longer and more expensive route around Africa. Domestically, this will mean that all of the positional advantages the country has in the global economy will be made more or less irrelevant, and the strong growth the country has been experiencing will become very hard to maintain. Of course, hopefully for everyone's sake, we are wrong. Okay, now it's time to put Egypt on the Economics Explained leaderboard, something that will be particularly important for this economy to give a bit of nominal context to the country's very apparent strengths and weaknesses. Starting as always with size, Egypt has a GDP of $347 billion, making it similar in size to Pakistan, Romania, and only slightly behind South Africa as the largest economy in Africa. It's the 42nd largest economy in the world currently, and it gets a 6 out of 10. That is spread out over the 13th largest population in the world, meaning that despite its decent overall output, it's still a low-income country. It has a GDP per capita of $3,225, which puts it behind Lebanon, Sri Lanka, and only barely ahead of India, despite being a more concentrated industrial economy. Even still, at less than a third of the global average, it gets a 2 out of 10. Stability and confidence is the thorn in the side of Egypt's potential. Over just the last decades, it's experienced revolutions and violent protests with a government that has shown its willingness to use extreme measures to entrench its own power. That has clearly hurt foreign investment and general interest to set up operations or trade relations with the country. It gets a 2 out of 10, but only because anything lower represents a country currently engaged in all-out conflict, mass social unrest, or an actual civil war. Growth, as we mentioned, has been very strong. The country wants to do well, and left to its own devices, it would probably naturally find a level of a lower middle-income manufacturing base. Now, while that doesn't sound like a lofty ambition, it would still be an improvement from its current reality. Its nominal growth has been around 60% over the last decade, but that is including a recovery from a major dip caused by the protests in 2016, so if things can remain stable, it could easily become one of the fastest growing major economies in the world. For now though, it gets a 7 out of 10. Industry currently is not huge or that advanced, and a lot of the population are still simple farmers. But its growth in manufacturing, basic services, trade accommodation, and of course some healthy assistance from natural resources means it gets a 6 out of 10. Altogether, that gives Egypt an average score of 4.6 out of 10, which puts it down here on the leaderboard. It also puts it just above Pakistan, another turbulent country that could be competing for the same role in the global economy. You should be able to click to that video on your screen now. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.